For centuries, the mere rumor of a Viking ship approaching was enough to spread panic through entire villages. From the late 8th century to well into the 11th, these warriors from the north terrorized Europe with speed, precision, and an almost ritualistic ferocity. But what made the Vikings such a feared threat wasn't just their brute strength. It was a complex mix of cultural, tactical, and technological factors that positioned them as one of the most effective fighting forces of their time. From childhood, Viking men were trained to fight in a society shaped by harsh climates, scarce resources, and the constant threat of conflict. Survival was not guaranteed. One had to know how to defend oneself. Boys were introduced to hunting, violent sports, and the use of basic weapons from an early age. But beyond play or entertainment, this training had a clear purpose: to prepare them for real combat. Every free man was responsible for his own defense, and by extension for the defense of his community. There was no option to be passive. Skill with a sword or axe wasn't a matter of prestige, it was a vital necessity. One of the lesser-known but fundamental aspects was systematic weapons training. It wasn't just about learning to swing a sword. The Vikings practiced a structured form of hand-to-hand combat known in Norse sources as glima. This ancestral martial art included techniques such as grapples, throws, locks, and even kicks. There were two main versions, one oriented toward real combat, and a more sportive variant used even by women and children as a form of physical preparation. Constant practice of glima and other disciplines ensured that a Viking warrior was not only strong but also technical, fast, and effective. Their advantage lay not just in muscle, but in precision honed over years of training. But even the best training can be useless without a proper weapon, and in this, the Vikings also excelled. While not everyone could afford the same equipment, weapons held a central place in Norse male identity. The poem Havamal, a collection of proverbs from the Viking Age, explicitly advised never taking a single step without carrying a spear or sword. The ideal warrior was always ready for combat. The wealthiest could afford finely forged swords like the legendary Ulfberht, a blade so advanced in its metallurgy that it still baffles experts today. Light, durable, and nearly impossible to replicate with common medieval techniques, these swords represented an overwhelming advantage on the battlefield. Artisan Richard Furrer, one of the few to attempt forging a Ulfberht using period methods, described it as the most difficult creation of his career. Those with fewer resources turned to spears, war axes, or simple knives made from rougher iron. Protection was also limited. Many relied on wooden shields and armor made of leather, or even animal hides like reindeer fur. However, this did not prevent them from joining larger armies, often under the command of wealthier chieftains who provided weapons in exchange for loyalty and participation in expeditions. Thus, even the humblest fighters could go into battle well armed, as long as they were willing to serve a leader and share in the loot. One of the most feared elements of the Viking war machine was their fleet. The drakars, with their dragon heads carved on the prow and elongated structure, were fast, light, and extremely versatile vessels. Narrow rivers allowed the Vikings to attack both coastal cities and villages deep inland. This mobility gave them immense tactical power. They could arrive unexpectedly, plunder in minutes, and disappear before any defensive force could react. More than an army, they were like a lightning strike. For those living in monasteries or small riverside communities, the mere sight of their sails on the horizon was a harbinger of imminent destruction. The fear the Vikings inspired wasn't solely due to their physical strength or swift ships. What made them truly terrifying was their view of life and death. Unlike many European peoples, the Vikings did not fear dying in battle. On the contrary, dying in combat was one of a warrior's highest aspirations. According to Norse beliefs, those who demonstrated extreme bravery on the battlefield were taken to Valhalla, the majestic hall of the god Odin, or to the field of Folkvangr, ruled by the goddess Freya. In both destinations, the spirits of the fallen continued to train, feast, and fight eternally, preparing for the end of the world, Ragnarok. This acceptance of ultimate sacrifice gave them an overwhelming psychological advantage. While other armies fought cautiously, trying to preserve lives, the Vikings advanced without fear, even with fervor, as if each battle were a gateway to glory. This mindset turned every confrontation into a display of absolute courage, and that alone, when facing more cautious opponents, could tip the balance of conflict before swords had even crossed. Tactically, the Vikings were far from improvised. They chose their targets with surgical precision. They knew, for example, that monasteries were filled with gold, jewels, and valuable manuscripts, but poorly defended. Likewise, coastal settlements or those on navigable rivers became ideal targets due to their easy access and limited ability to react. But it wasn't just about opportunity. The Vikings had networks of intelligence. They spied, observed movements, evaluated weaknesses, and acted at the exact right moment. If a kingdom was in internal crisis, or if an army was far away, a raid was almost guaranteed. Thanks to this level of planning, sporadic attacks evolved into systematic campaigns of conquest. They took over entire regions of England, Ireland, northern France, and even pushed into the heart of what is now Russia. Combat morale was also a key pillar. Viking warriors formed groups united by bonds of blood, loyalty, and shared life. They rode together, slept together, plundered together. This deep camaraderie created a collective sense of responsibility and pride in combat. A Viking did not fight for himself alone, but for the honor of the group. To flee was an unbearable shame, not only personal, but familial. The stigma of cowardice could haunt a lineage for generations. For this reason, even in desperate situations, Vikings rarely surrendered. They preferred to fall fighting, clinging to their swords with the hope of reaching eternity alongside the warrior gods. But among all Norse fighters, there was one group that inspired singular terror: the berserkers. These warriors, clad in bear or wolf pelts, were described in the sagas as almost supernatural figures. They entered a state of uncontrollable fury known as berserkergang, during which they lost all sense of pain, fear, or fatigue. It was said that they bit their shields before attacking, roared like beasts, and charged without armor, immune to iron and fire. Their mere presence could demoralize an enemy before the first clash. The exact origin of this berserker fury remains uncertain. Some researchers believe it was a trance induced by religious beliefs and psychological preparation. Others suggest possible neurological causes, such as epilepsy, and there are also those who point to the use of psychoactive substances like hallucinogenic mushrooms or plants such as henbane, Hyoscyamus niger. Interestingly, in a Viking tomb discovered in Denmark in 1977, seeds of this plant were found, further fueling this hypothesis. Whatever the cause, the truth is that the berserkers embodied the most brutal extreme of the Viking warrior spirit: combat without limits, without fear, and without apparent humanity. Over time, however, the figure of the berserker fell into disgrace. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, uncontrolled violence ceased to be seen as a virtue. In the year 1015, the Norwegian king Erik Håkonsson formally banned the berserkers, and by the 11th century, their traces in history had begun to fade. But their legend, like that of the Viking people in general, lived on. They were not just pirates, nor merely invaders. They were a warrior civilization shaped by ice, death, and ambition. Their memory still echoes along the coasts they once made tremble. If you're passionate about the Viking world, Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories about their warriors, beliefs, and most epic battles. Were you surprised by anything you learned today? Tell us in the comments. What part of Viking culture do you find most fascinating?